Hey folks, this is a lecture on violence and nonviolence, but more precisely, it's a lecture on how do we change a system if it's unjust? How do we either get rid of the system we have or alter the system in a significant way? And I think that this is sort of a blind spot for a lot of political theory, starting all the way back with Plato, where you come out of the cave and then you go back in and then you lie to the people, and myth of metals, and then you get a new state. Like, how does all this happen? Or all the way up to foundational theorists for modern liberalism like Locke. What do you do if the majority disagrees with you and treats you in a fundamentally unjust way? You appeal to God, right? You say you either try to overthrow them, and when you can't, like, tough luck. Right. So a lot of these theorists don't really explain, well, what do you do in these situations? And in, some respects, perhaps that's because a lot of these theorists are writing um, from a position of political power or dominance, even if it's a contested one, like in the English Civil Wars. This is, I think, one of the real improvements we've made to this class in our attempts to decolonize. There's sort of like a meta phenomenon going on here with decolonizing the course and improving it with this segment, but also we are reading about decolonization and the fight against colonialism and racism. So here we're pulling together Franz Fanon, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr., and I think that they contrast really nicely. We're going to go slide by slide with these little videos, and hopefully we won't take too long. All right, folks, we are starting with Mohandas Gandhi, probably the most important advocate for the philosophy or a philosophy of nonviolence in modern history and history as far back as we've been studying. You typically hear him referred to as Mahatma, which is an honorific, Mohandas being his given name. We have here in the corner sort of a classic picture of Gandhi in his homespun simple robes. We can talk about that a little bit longer. We have sort of the classic young Gandhi here in his Western garb, handsome gentleman there, and then of course we have down here Ben Kingsley playing Gandhi in the movie Gandhi, which is terrific. It's 3 hours long. It's a long one, but it is fantastic, and I recommend it to everyone. So Gandhi was a lawyer by training, educated in London. This is a picture from that era of his life. Handsome gent. While he was doing his legal training, he advocated for the poor and was on the executive committee of the London Vegetarian Society. Just thought I'd mention that. It was a period in which he took sort of some of his Hindu values and started to translate them into more philosophical moral beliefs, including his belief that vegetarianism was a important part of moral purity, of striving for a human ideal where you don't hurt anyone. And that's something that comes through, I think, in our readings for Gandhi. So after he got done with his legal training, he went off to South Africa for 20 years and worked on Indian rights in South Africa. This is where he engaged in a lot of his early protest activity, was jailed, beaten, discriminated against, and through all this he developed his philosophy of satyagraha, which we read about, force of truth, or there are a lot of different translations to this, but the idea of truth having a force to transform the world is sort of central to it, right? It's a philosophy of opposing evil through nonviolent resistance. It's inspired by Thoreau, the American theorist, as well as Tolstoy, who he had some correspondence with. Important to note, and was noted by some folks in this class, that Gandhi's early work in particular had some sort of complicated positions on race concerning Black South Africans. His work was overwhelmingly for Indians in South Africa, and sometimes Chinese or other Asian groups. And some of this was framed in his rhetoric and in his actions as trying to secure the rights for these groups of white South Africans, with some neglect of the interests of Black South Africans, and a lot of it has been made of this. One thing I would say on it is, it's early. Younger Gandhi, he's not a saint. He's a complicated individual, and by most accounts, his views did evolve on issues of race. And he got the Nelson Mandela stamp of approval eventually after his death. And he's part of now the South African canon of social justice. And right, it's worth noting these things, but it's also probably a good idea not to get too hung up on particular points of biography, particularly as we go back and we read some of these ancient folks, and we don't know much about their biographies. I mean, they get off the hook, but people living today who are better documented, they get put through the ringer. It's something to note. Um, he's most well known, for going back home to India and leading the push for, and I'm gonna mispronounce this, Swaraj, which is the idea of self rule, Indian independence from colonial rule by Britain, which he worked for some 30 years plus, but really that last decade before independence was finally achieved in 1947. He was the main figure pushing for independence from Britain, and it is notable. It's really quite historic that this movement was led by this national movement was led by someone committed to the philosophy of nonviolence, and he was able to make that the philosophy of Indian independence by and large, certainly not universally. Um, Gandhi will be the first one to tell you this is not about passivity. This is about non-cooperation that is strictly nonviolent, which can be strikes, can be boycotts, particularly of British goods, but also of British institutions. You see him here. He was dressing and eating in very common ways, in part to show solidarity with the poor people of India and the rest of the world. And particularly, he did more than any other individual to break down the Indian caste system and the caste system that placed a category of untouchables at the bottom. Gandhi, attacked that head on and deserves a lot of credit for that. But he's also not merely making this sort of moral statement about poverty here. He is making a statement about I'm going to make my own clothes domestically instead of buying the British goods, the British clothing that you see him in here. Right, so there's a political statement in that as well, and we talk about his clothes and his food and things like that, but he perhaps more importantly advocated for the boycotting of British law, British courts, British political institutions, really tried to undermine the ability of the British to govern in India. So not passive at all. And famously, man, the music's really blasting outside in Red Square. Famously, right, he led the Salt March. There was, much like in the American Revolution, stamp tax, sugar tax, things like that. There was a salt tax, and Indians weren't allowed to produce their own salt. They had to pay this heavy British tax on salt. It's considered an essential to life. And he led, thousands of people down to the ocean to make their own salt. And it's sort of, both an important moment and a symbolic moment in the kind of struggle that they had. Imprisoned many times over the years in South Africa and in India, beaten many times while maintaining a nonviolent posture. He also is famous for his fasts, for not eating. And he did this to shame his opponents, the British, but he also did this, I think, notably to shame his own people. when riots broke out or when there was religious violence, he would institute fasts and sort of bring shame on the people who were violating satyagraha and sort of bring them back into the fold. And it was effective, right, at him maintaining that sort of focus in the movement. Um, Related, right? We read a bit about his pacifism, even against Hitler and Nazism. He opposed entry into both wars. And British entry into those wars. And he also, importantly, strongly opposed the colonization of Palestine in roughly this same period in the 1940s. And right, has these writings about being a friend of the Jews, and yet opposing their settling of Palestinian territory. After independence, just a year after independence, he was assassinated by a Indian Hindu nationalist who felt that he was too gracious, too supportive of the Muslim minority in India during the partition of India and Pakistan, which was a great trauma for India. And that I think that speaks a lot for the kind of person he was, the kind of role he played in Indian politics. It's an interesting question. What would have happened with India? What would have happened with Pakistan had Gandhi survived? And it's something that we'll see over and over again with a lot of these figures. King, an eerie parallel there. So, all right, let's go on to our next slide. All right, folks, let's talk a little bit about the thought of Mahatma Gandhi and his idea of satyagraha, which he was at pains to be clear was not a passive form of resistance or non resistance, really. And I think that there's a strong philosophy behind this. And I like that he states explicitly that this is about withdrawing cooperation from the state and its institutions. Right, he calls it specifically a weapon of the strongest, not of the weakest, both because of the moral force and determination it takes to enact it and stick with it, but also in his mind, the force that this kind of method can wield in politics. And when I say that there's a philosophy and a clear understanding of how this power works, Gandhi is saying that if you withdraw cooperation, things shut down. There's disruption. What Francis Fox Piven, the contemporary scholar, one of the most famous contemporary scholars of social movements, calls disruptive power. And Piven talks about disruption. She talks about a wide range of types of political action, including things like rioting and violence. Gandhi is arguing that those are not acceptable forms of disruption, but that satyagraha has to involve disruption in order to challenge, call out, disrupt evil institutions. So part of this kind of non-violent resistance for Gandhi and for King is a sort of scrupulous commitment to following the law when the law is just, to establish yourself as not an enemy of law and order, but as a true friend of law, of just law. So you follow just laws, and moreover, when you break unjust laws, you accept the punishment or you accept the violence that the state or its allies put upon you, right? And I think that this is right. This differentiates this kind of action from insurgency or something like that. No, right? You break the law, you acknowledge that it's the law, you go to jail willingly, and through that action, you highlight the injustice of the law and of the institution and hopefully change it. That's the idea here. So how is this supposed to work? So first off, one of the virtues for Mahatma Gandhi, probably the most important virtue, perhaps, is that it purifies the participants through your opposition to evil. You enhance your dignity, you secure your human dignity, you make yourself more upright and virtuous. You hone your strength of will and your willingness to sacrifice. You become a stronger, more determined, more committed to justice type person. And this makes you the type of loving, giving person that Gandhi thinks all people can strive to be. That it's sort of, like with Aristotle and teleology, the excellence of our character as human beings is to be peaceful, loving beings. Um, right? So your sacrifice, your dignity, your peacefulness, your nonviolence, it contrasts with the violence and the punishment that is visited upon you by the state and by the state's forces and allies. And that exposes and highlights and contrasts your justice to their injustice, right? So the ideas and the laws of that you're opposing are revealed to all. To be unjust. And that appeals to the common humanity of allies and potential allies, people who might, need to get in the game and participate, opponents, the people who are actively oppressing you. And in this case, we're talking in part about the British public, who directs the British government. So he's appealing to the British public, common citizens of the British public, and also observers, third parties that might put pressure on the oppressor to not be such a terrible immoral state. And he thinks there's an optimism here. And he even, he says, hey, at the most extreme, who's to say that, the Nazis and the people of Germany under the Nazi state don't have this kind of common humanity? If we could put, their crimes front and center in front of the German people, or even many Nazi officers, perhaps we could change them. Perhaps we could convince them to cease their injustice. Right? That sounds, to a lot of people like pie in the sky. Let's be honest. Gandhi won independence for the Indian people. It's the world's largest democracy now, on the heels of Gandhi's action. So, right, there's a good track record for him here. Maybe you don't believe the Nazi example. Maybe you believe that makes Gandhi ridiculous. But as we'll get to in a minute, his consistency on these issues, including Nazi invasions of Europe and Nazi atrocities in the Holocaust, his commitment to nonviolence in the face of all those things tells us something about what's really going on with Gandhi. And practical victory is one element of it, but maybe not the most important element. And now, importantly, and I think King takes a lot from this in his reading of Gandhi. Gandhi was very concerned with the idea of what happens after the conflict is done. How do you make your opponents and your enemies, be they the British or be they conflicting ethnic or religious groups, into a community that can live together and that can strive for a better, more moral, way of governing the community and living with each other. Right. This was the struggle doesn't end just because the British are gone. We still have to deal with the British. We still have to deal with each other. How do we create a situation where our actions in confronting force don't make us into the very thing that we're trying to get rid of? Now, I think central to Gandhi's approach here is this view that ideas have power, right? That ideas shape the world. We talk about Gandhi in international relations classes as the quintessential constructivist, or example of constructivism, someone who wields power, changes the political order, changes the rights and privileges and resources that accrue to different people through the spread of ideas. I call this sort of the Hegel over Marx in all of these theorists that we're dealing with now. This idea of Hegel: do ideas shape our reality, and the material world matches to fit our ideas. Different ideas, religions, ideologies sort of confront each other, and the dominant ones shape the way we behave. Or does our material reality, the institutions, and particularly the economic institutions and the power institutions, do they determine what ideas develop? And Mahatma Gandhi clearly, I think, is on the side of ideas, as is Martin Luther King. But again, with the Nazi example, I think you see that for Gandhi, there is very much this idea of a life of dignity and a life worth living. You see this also for King, maybe to a lesser extent, but this idea of I'm not going to let you, the oppressor, make me into a monster. I am going to be my best me, and that's how I'm going to live a good life. And so, in opposing you, I'm not going to let you drag me down to your level. I am going to prioritize my purity. I'm not going to kill. I'm not going to torture. I'm not going to maim. I am not going to oppress anyone on my way to liberation. I'm going to give you every right that I say that I'm entitled to. And for Gandhi, I think that has an individual element. And by the way, he's pulling on Thoreau, and Thoreau is sort of over the top in terms of this, like moral purity over results kind of thing, right? Thoreau, sort of famously, his boycotts really had no chance or very little chance of any kind of actual social change happening in the opposition that Thoreau had to American slavery and to the Mexican American War. And Thoreau was kind of famously like, I don't care. It's not my responsibility to change the world. It's my responsibility to not be a party to evil and to be morally sort of pure and upstanding. And Gandhi, I don't think, is taking it that far. He's saying, yes, I do 100% believe that this is the best path towards change. But if it's not, it's still the only path towards a dignified and meaningful life. All right, on to Dr. King. We're all probably somewhat familiar with the life and activism and impact that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has had on America and on the world. And I'll run through a few of the highlights here. But my favorite highlight is these sub points here. I think the reading that we do for this class, Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, is fantastic. It shows the ways in which engaging with the canon of political theory, but not engaging with it in sort of a subservient way, like these are the options. But seeing what can we get from it, what can we make of it, where are its blind spots, how can I engage with it in a way that's meaningful for the big conflicts that confront me today and my society today? I think that King's discussion of the political theory canon and how it relates to his development and commitment to the ideas of nonviolence is really illuminating. All right, so of course, King here, this is a picture of King, famously in jail during the Birmingham campaign in 1963, where he wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail. Also a great work of political theory that we're not doing. But famous, the most famous American civil rights activist, Baptist minister. But remember, he's Dr. King, right? He did a PhD in systematic theology. I don't know exactly what that is. But one thing I can tell you, and that you can tell from our reading, is that King's views on theology, right? Christian theology was clearly super primary and influential for him. But he also engaged with his faith in sort of dialogue with philosophy and with the philosophers that he studied. And I think that it's interesting to see the interplay of those two things. Thoreau, he talks about reading, and Gandhi, Gandhi he calls the greatest Christian of the 20th century. Right, he loves that line. He uses it often. The greatest Christian of the 20th century wasn't even a Christian. He was a Hindu. And right, that's his way often of telling audiences that it's about what you do, how you live, not what book you carry around and how much you attend church and things like that. Right, this doctrine of social activism in the church is one that King, as a young student and then as a minister, believed in deeply. Uh, but when you read him talk about Plato, Aristotle, Rousseau, Hobbes, Bentham, Mill, Locke, Nietzsche, Marx, Hegel, all people, all that he read, and he just throws out there, oh, I was reading not just the Communist Manifesto, but Das Kapital, just massive, difficult work of Marx. I've never made it all the way through Capital. You see that King is, a real, true intellectual, alongside also being, a great, politician and activist. He is, right. He's a big thinker. Cornel West calls him the greatest organic intellectual of the 20th century, and it's hard for me to disagree. The more I've read King's actual writing, the more respect I've had. It's hard not to respect King, though some people, right? We can have that discussion. But the more respect I've had for King's intellect as a real intellectual giant. I will note, right, as I mentioned with Gandhi, saying, Gandhi really is on the side of Hegel in terms of the power of ideas. Again, I love to see that King comes in. He's like, I'm on the side. I think Marx gets a lot of it right. I think he gets, his critique of capitalism and his critique of poverty and inequality is spot on in terms of the horrors of this part of our system, and yet there's no role for the transformative force of human virtue and specifically of human ideology, and in his case, Christian love, and Christian ideology. And he's like, I can't accept that, right? I really believe that ideas, and specifically our commitment, like with Gandhi and his truth force, King's commitment to love, agape, love thy enemy. He believes in a transformative power of staying true to your ideas and highlighting them for all to see. Again, much like Gandhi, he's pulling from Gandhi very heavily, and for that reason, it puts him in the Hegel camp. This idea that the material world is really messed up, but the way we're going to transform it is with this highlighting of our ideas and our ideals. Right, so King's career, Montgomery bus boycott, his assumption of leadership of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that he was leader of until his death. His most famous campaign, the Birmingham campaign, which, along with the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, I think it's worth noting those two things in his thinking there. Not that he was the driving force behind the march, right? A. Philip Randolph, it's famously his march, but King has come to stand for its meaning and its most impactful moment. But these two 1963 actions very directly led to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, probably the greatest piece of legislation in American history, alongside maybe some of the New Deal, with maybe the exception of the 1965 voting rights, which very directly followed from the confrontations between King's nonviolent protesters, marchers, and violent police forces in Selma, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, along with in Birmingham in that more extended campaign there, and led to the 65 voting rights, led to the 64 Civil Rights Act, arguably. In a way similar to Gandhi's push for independence, you see tangible major changes on the most difficult issues in American political society and political history, associated here with King's nonviolent campaign. And, right, we contrast that to the Civil War. which took the greatest expression of American political violence in American history to achieve that change. And right, those are two cases for violence and nonviolence there. But King, a believer here in the power of nonviolence, and he has some results to show for it. The Chicago campaign notable, right, for the limitations of King's nonviolent method after the '65 Voting Rights Act took his organization, its work to Chicago to try to desegregate non-Jim Crow states, and said he was met with more hatred in Chicago by white residents in Chicago than he ever faced in Alabama. Worth noting. King also a vocal and visible opponent of the Vietnam War, his Chicago campaign, his opposition to the Vietnam War, and his embrace in the last year of his life, the last years of his life, of the Poor People's Campaign, which is still going today, but had its roots in 1968. King tackling racism beyond segregation in Chicago, tackling militarism in Vietnam, tackling poverty and inequality in the Poor People's Campaign in '68. You really see King's work persisting and evolving, and right, like we don't want to let King stand in simply for opposition to Jim Crow, right? There was a much larger agenda of consistently and permanently opposing and struggling against evil that you see throughout King's life and into his death. He was, of course, assassinated in '68 in Memphis by a white segregationist while he was there supporting black sanitation workers, sanitation union, striking for better wages, benefits, working conditions. And so you can see, right, he's fighting in the end. Not just in terms of racial discrimination, but he dies fighting at this nexus of race and class, which I think is always worth noting. All right, it's worth noting sort of two aspects here of King's philosophy. One of which is sort of the four evils that he identifies in America and the world, and then the second is, of course, his method of nonviolent struggle. Man, I love this picture of King. You wonder. You look at a young Gandhi. You look at King, Fanon next. You wonder if these people would be so important if they weren't so good looking. I don't know, right? The charisma just kind of oozes off of King even before you hear his speaking voice, which is, of course, right, up there with the greatest rhetoricians of all time. I guess I don't know. Can't go back and get recordings of pre-modern speeches, but boy, King is a great speaker, but also a handsome gent here. So the four great evils that we are facing, that he viewed as interconnected and all quite important. Of course, we know King's advocacy against racism and racial caste in America. Civil rights, equal protection, rule of law, right? Fighting in many respects, a liberal campaign for the acquisition of basic American rights for all American citizens. Importantly, King's focus was always on integration. And I think that, like with Gandhi, is significant. The idea that in the end, King's philosophy always gave significant weight to the idea that after the conflict, hopefully there is an after the conflict, right? After the conflict, we all have to live together. And this idea that one side winning or one side losing, and that power shift occurring with both sides hating each other, or animosity and bad feeling, and the legacy of harms between groups growing and deepening. King thought this was sort of a lose-lose for everyone. He thought it was a path to mutual destruction and resistance. And so he thought it was essential, as did Gandhi, to find a path of resistance that had a chance of victory that was like real victory, that was a victory with a peace that could be enjoyed by all, principally by those who have suffered injustice and are struggling against it. Right. So it's universal in its aspirations for all of humanity. But King, always recognized that if push came to shove, he would have to prioritize his own oppressed people, and yet he thought there was no way to do that in terms of seeking the kind of victory that Fanon will advocate through violence. So racism, right? Racism with integration and community between a former oppressor and oppressed as the goal. Poverty inequality. This was such a huge focus with King. He explicitly at various times endorsed democratic socialism and various forms of leftist progressivism, though not as we know Marxism as an ideology. He was a big supporter of organized labor, died supporting organized labor. He made comments suggesting that there should be stronger welfare spending and social support, including a universal basic income, as an idea that King was a fan of. And more generally, he was an advocate in saying, like, we are going to have to increase taxes substantially and increase social spending to create a more just, more equal society. That is a priority. That is essential, and that was always, at the heart of King's thought. And after civil rights legislation and formal equal protection of the 64 and 65 bills was put in place, King, for the rest of his life, which was a short 3 years, shifted his focus more centrally to poverty and inequality. And this is something that is often left out of his legacy, that King would, have deep, deep concerns about the levels of inequality today and what we're doing about it. Materialism, right? He was concerned with inequality, but he was also concerned with our obsession over money and consumption. He thought this was a distraction. And again, you can go back to Plato and Aristotle, who thought, wealth and poverty were both troublesome in terms of building virtue and building community. It ends up fostering greed and us versus them. How do I keep mine? How do I get yours? And King, really was concerned with, he would say things like a spiritual poverty that we've got right now, a lack of spirituality, a lack of virtue, a lack of commitment to the community and to our fellow people. And this was, again, this is one of the virtues of his method. He argued is that it can focus us away from materialism and more towards community struggle, and rehabilitating our souls was something that King had in mind. And then finally, militarism, right? Part of his pacifism was directed not simply at domestic police militarism, but also at international war and militarism. And King was facing a Cold War that was dominated by nuclear proliferation and the threat of total annihilation between the sides. And a lot of King's writings actually talk about how the model that he's applying in terms of civil rights and nonviolence to build a national community between oppressor and oppressed, between opponents, deeply, deeply, deeply divided opponents, that this holds all the more promise and all the more sort of pressing need in the international situation as we try to build bridges and build global community between nations that could, destroy the planet at the drop of a hat. And so he sees this philosophy of nonviolence as essential to creating both nations and a world where we can all get along as equal citizens of our nation or as our world. He also, though, right, beyond the idealism and the virtue shaping nature of hey, you don't want to go to war and kill other people, and you degrade yourself as a killer, and you divide yourself from others as people who are not worthy of life, who you need to kill or destroy. But he also noted that connected to number two here, that the military-industrial complex, and also notably the amount of money we spend on policing in America and incarceration. He noted that these things, but particularly our military budget, the more they expanded, the less was available for fighting against poverty, both globally and in America. And so this drain on resources, he thought, was an essential threat from militarism. Um, all right, in terms of how he sought to fight these evils, he's of course modeling his thought on Gandhi, but also on the Christian sort of philosophy of agape, of unconditional love, which he calls, and I think maybe he does a little bit of work here that might not be faithful to traditions in the Bible, but of shaping this idea of agape, of loving unconditionally humanity as an active love, as a need to act, to embrace, to help, to be concerned for the needs of others. And he believes that this is sort of, again, the ultimate sort of spiritual goal is this kind of love that is not conditional. It's not based on some kind of reciprocal trade. It's based on sort of a love of the dignity of all mankind. And these are sort of the driving forces of his philosophy. All right, so he ends up sounding in his descriptions of nonviolence very much like Gandhi. He talks about it as an active opposition. There are five in the essay we read, 5 points he makes. There's an active opposition to evil. He says specifically it's spiritually active in the sense that it refines and grows and strengthens your values and your commitments to those spiritual values. It's purifying in this sense, right? It makes you a better person. It strips you away from the hatred of militarism, the selfishness of materialism. It distracts you or pulls you away from the sort of vicious envy that can come from poverty. Again, going back to Plato, Aristotle, people recognize this. And then it blunts race hatred for all, but particularly here, right? It pushes you not to hate your enemy, and that's number 5 as well. There's a lot of overlap in these. I think most importantly here, again, this idea that the ultimate goal, that the ultimate victory, particularly for King, in a struggle within a community where right, like white and black. Everyone involved in this civil rights struggle for King is an American with nowhere to go, right? It's not like eject the colonizers, right? The colonizers, to the extent that white America plays that structural role, this is their homeland. There is nowhere that anyone is going. And so I think this highlights for King in a way that maybe doesn't hold true for Fanon, who's talking about, hey, British, get the F out of here. That we're going to have to share this country. And King says the only peaceful, productive, happy, ethical way to share is as a country is as a single community. Again, his goal of integration. And we see a lot of this also with South Africa and the goals of post-apartheid South Africa, trying to heal that community. Successful to some degree. King also sees this as the ultimate goal, right? The only way that anyone ever really wins is not simply by trying to replace or knock down or get a leg up on the opponent, but by seeking to eliminate the status of opposition, right? Not be opponents anymore, but instead be a single community. Right, ruled by the principles of agape and love of your common man, and he thinks that nonviolence is the only way forward there. Now, note in the next slide with Franz Fanon that he actually thinks he agrees that violence begets violence, violence begets division, violence begets hatred, and he says that's good. That's good. That's what you need to beat the colonizer. Right, so you see that there's sort of a parallel, and the question comes up between Fanon and King. Well, if violence is not a possible solution to victory in Fanon's sense of we won, it's ours, you've been subordinated or expelled or killed. If that's not a possibility, might Fanon say, well, geez, I guess you got to seek to come to some kind of working understanding with the oppressor. I suspect that Fanon might not be down with that because of the psychological harms of colonization that need to be healed and addressed. But King, I think, certainly stands on strong ground with this idea of, and I think about this in terms of sometimes when outside groups come in and agitate at school board meetings and things like that, and you find yourself, national groups come and they insert themselves into local controversies around things like critical race theory, and then after the controversy is over, or it settles down, all of those people leave, and the people in the community have to live there, right, with each other, in the same schools, in the same school boards, in the same community. And I think that there's something to be said for prioritizing a method that can achieve justice, but also can secure peace and community. That is the ideal that King is putting forward here. And part of that, and this sounds like Ibram X. Kendi today and his anti-racism, but the idea of attacking the forces of evil, the idea is the institutions, segregations, the laws that promote segregation, the institutions that support it, instead of the people, instead of focusing on people as bad or evil or your enemies. And we've seen, right, there's a little bit of a Marxist element of this too, right? We've seen that that this does work, that people's ideas and what they think is right or wrong or acceptable or unacceptable shifts after the law change. You make people live under a policy, and their ideas do, to some extent, acclimate to it. And so, Ibram Kendi says, yeah, you don't have to reach hearts and minds. If you change the law, you get rid of segregation, you get rid of various other racist laws, people will become less racist. And King, I think, was seeking here that kind of approach, but also again this idea that building community, building unity between people means attacking the institutions and not the people. Nobody likes to be attacked. Practically speaking, divisions deepen when attacks are personalized. Right, that's the theory. Like with Gandhi, King thought that making stark and clear, particularly in the face of ideologies like racism, that we're the good guys and you're the bad guys, or that kind of conflicts with three. But we're the good guys. Our cause, our ideas are the just one, and these ideas and institutions are the evil ones. He thinks that accepting punishment is and violence, being arrested, letting the police or courting the violence of the police, of the mob, that this is essential. And right, when we study social movements, I think there's a strong case to be made that King that this plays out for King, that that the conflict, the violence that is courted in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, particularly the targeting of violent racist sheriffs in places like Birmingham and Selma. Other King campaigns where they faced more restrained sheriffs, you don't hear about Albany. You don't hear about some of these less successful campaigns. What was successful about his campaigns was, we're going to be the good guys, the peaceful guys, the nonviolent guys. They're going to attack us with dogs and fire hoses and batons and scream at us and scream at our children who are standing peacefully and calmly with our signs saying things like, I am a man. And the whole world, all right, the people involved will feel shamed by this, because they'll see it and they'll see a mirror held up to their face and they won't like what they see. The rest of the country, the majority, the white majority, right, will see this and say, oh God, we can't be on that side. We have to be on King's side. And the world, the international community, that we're part of enmeshed in an international world here, and a Cold War, by the way, right? And to be the evil racist country is not a good look, right? And nobody wants to be on that side. Really, King, I think, does exercise significant power here and twists the hands of Kennedy and then LBJ through this sort of public act of contrition and welcoming of violent racism. Right? There is actual power that does seem to be evidence here. And in refusing to hate, not simply to strike, but to hate the opposition. King both furthers, items 3 and 4, but I think also importantly for him, is this idea of I will never let you drag me down so low that my heart is full of hate, that I'm a vicious, angry, consumed by rage and hatred and the desire to hurt and harm. I don't want to be that kind of person. I want to be a person lifted up by love and compassion, and community and brotherhood. And I refuse to hate. I refuse to be debased by oppression. I will purify myself, and I will come out of this holding the moral high ground, both for practical, strategic reasons, but also because you want to be on the moral high ground. That is the ground you most want to occupy in this world. So again, he thinks that nonviolence refines the spirit. It heals community and makes a life after conflict possible. He thinks it's the only practical way to overcome a superior force. And again, I think this is something to contrast with, say, Franz Fanon. Um, King very explicitly said, "What does it mean for 10% of America, Black America, divested of resources and military force, weaponry, to court violence against a white majority, to sort of solidify hatred and antagonism between a large, well-resourced majority of the country that has all of the political, economic, and military power, and say, let's go toe-to-toe and let's fight it out in the streets." King says that's courting disaster. That's courting genocide and extermination. And if that were the only option, I'd be curious what King would say to that. But he thinks that there is a practical alternative, and it's an alternative that, again, he also thinks pursues our spiritual needs, makes us more fully human. And again, as I noted, prevents mutual destruction. Right? Even if somehow the white majority could be taken down through militant guerrilla action, he asks himself, what would that look like? What would that world look like? It would be, a world of terrible bloodshed, with no ethical, moral, humane community emerging out the other side. And in the international context, even if you could get your nukes off first against the Soviets, right? He's saying you're going to destroy the world. You're going to be living in a post-apocalyptic nightmare. And so he sees this parallel between civil rights struggle and the Cold War struggle. He says you can't solve either of these through violence and through defeating on the field of battle the opponent. You need to end the conflict on just terms, and the only way you can do that is through moral, ethical, high ground, nonviolent resistance. And right, that's King in a nutshell there. All right, on to Franz Fanon. Psychiatrist, doctor, psychoanalyst, philosopher. Really, these are all psychiatrists by training, which makes him a doctor. He has a psychoanalytic approach to psychiatry, and ends up being one of the great thinkers of decolonization. If you're looking for a good quote, and I pulled this off the back of the popular press, "Wretched of the Earth," I have Angela Davis's quote here of the century's most compelling theorist of racism and colonialism. Right, pretty high praise from Angela Davis there. And also, let's add in, right, he continues our trend of very handsome revolutionaries here. Important to know as we attempt to decolonize the curriculum and decolonize this class, that in terms of decolonization as a theory, I think there's no one more central than Fanon. And right. So grappling with his works on this topic seems somewhat essential, right? He's a major political theorist, and he gives some teeth to that approach with this class. Fanon's born in Martinique in the Caribbean in a French colony. He eventually is, there's a lot of biography here, but he eventually is educated in France and gets his degree in psychiatry in France. And he's experiencing both in the French military and then in his time studying in France, um, racism against him as a black colonial subject, and this is solidifying um, his views on these topics and giving him some perspective, he would say, of the experiences and the traumas uh, and the psychological harms that he went through as a colonial subject living in a French colony, and that getting to France and studying these topics, studying psychology and psychiatry, studying philosophy, seeing the workings of different parts of the world, including France, gives him some perspective on this. After his education in France, he goes and works as a psychiatrist practicing in North Africa, in Algeria, another French colony, and he eventually is just is looking at the oppression of the Algerians, starts to support their National Liberation Front. Which is considered a terrorist organization by the French, and eventually, essentially joins it, starts working directly with them. And this is in the 50s. He lives a relatively short life, but in this time he produces some rather important works. The first work, which he produced in France as sort of his thesis, is Black Skin, White Mask, which I have taught in this class before. And it lays out this case for the psychic damage, the psychological damage to the subjects of colonization. So, right, the colonized live under a colonized world. They lived under colonized norms and laws and institutions, and those are the things that shape their worldview. So they grow up, and you see this in a lot of great civil rights writing. You see this in James Baldwin's writing, or that there's I'd say Ta-Nehisi Coates and Between the World and Me express this in a very modern American sense. But they're the foundational theorist of all this is Fanon. Though I think you have to throw in Du Bois as well, who's writing before Fanon. But come on, let's I'm trying to make this class a little bit more international. We can't just kick it back to Du Bois. But Fanon gives us this idea that when one's experience of the world, of being black and being a colonial subject, is at odds with all of the norms and laws and institutions that value whiteness and colonial and the colonist identity, that there's this constant sort of grating schism or dissonance between these two things, and it produces shame and neurotic behaviors and a constant sort of bath of trauma that people grow up in. And we the modern psychology bears a lot of this out in terms of racial discrimination as a central childhood trauma, along the lines of other things like physical or sexual or abuse or neglect, or the death of a parent, or other things that are considered to be major developmental traumas. Growing up in a society where the social norms and institutions tell you you're not worthwhile and you are not good enough, and that you are somehow stained or corrupted or evil as he says, through much of the wretched of the earth, that this is psychologically damaging, and that it's hard to find a place in the world and find a stable, healthy adult psychology. And this leads him to both describe the harms of colonization, but also to be more firmly committed to the idea that it's not about good jobs. It's not about making sure that people aren't going hungry, though those are very important. He's a Marxist at heart, but what Fanon lays out here is this idea that living under um, the shadow of the white man or the colonist is fundamentally and incorrectably or unfixably uh, damaging, right? It's dehumanizing, and it's an unacceptable way to live, which I think plays in, at least in part, to his commitment to fight colonial rule at any cost, right? Again, this idea of he does believe in violence as a pragmatic and effective way, and I think he makes a strong case for it, for throwing off colonial rule. And yet also, it's in either a moral or an amoral case, right? That the fundamental need. It's a little bit like Hobbes and his discussion of how you don't, in the state of nature, you don't owe obligations to anyone else. You're obligated to protect yourself. And in Fanon's view, the colonized are essentially at the mercy, and they are being destroyed psychically as well as physically and economically by their colonizers, and they owe them nothing. Right, their only moral obligation is to their community and their fellows, and that completely excludes the colonizer. There are two communities here, and they're at odds. And unlike King, unlike Gandhi, he sees no unity, no happy us together afterwards. It's they're on top, we're on the bottom, and the only acceptable solutions are us on top, them on the bottom, or them eliminated, either gone from our land, or dead. And he sees this as right, as a moral imperative. Um, all right, let's move on then. All right, folks. So my computer ran out of battery and shut down, and I lost about 20 minutes of recording on this slide. I bet it was pretty good. We'll see if we can do better. I have my doubts. So Fanon's probably most important work, the one that we read a substantial portion from, is The Wretched of the Earth. If Black Skin, White Mask is sort of him laying out the fundamental psychological harm that is created by colonization and by racial caste. The Wretched of the Earth is sort of his, well, what are we going to do about it? And it's become a manifesto, really, for colonized people seeking liberation. Yes, in Algeria, it was the specific reference, but in Africa and all across the world, it's a hugely influential book. Um, so, what perspective do we find in The Wretched of the Earth? You'll see Marxism runs throughout the book, right? The discussions of the bourgeois and the proletariat, discussions of, as you see in this second point, the ways in which the political order and power structure are maintained by a superstructure of institutions, values, and ideas that claim to be neutral, that claim to be objective, but really serve the interests of the power class, in this case, not just the bourgeois, but the colonizers, right? That's the sort of shift here. It's clearly a precursor of critical race theory in the way it attacks supposedly neutral ideologies like liberalism, like human rights. People are, Fanon says throughout the book, people in the West are always claiming to be speaking for man, the rights of man, human rights, the values of man, the dignity of man, the salvation of man spiritually through religion. In all of these cases, those words and those ideas have been put towards dehumanizing actual men and enslaving actual men and robbing and exploiting actual men. And sort of, that's a theme that runs throughout. Um, very hard on Christianity and religion in general, very much making out this idea that religion functions as an opioid of the masses, just like Marx says, and is very specific about that in the colonial context, but also says that colonization has destroyed and distorted and made use of local myth in order to present other divisions, other um, uh, uh, factional disputes, as well as other fears, including supernatural or mythical fears. And he talks a lot in the book about zombies and the way zombies are employed in some way. Oh, don't be afraid of the colonizer. Be afraid of the zombies. Worry about them. They're the real source of your danger or problem or things like. Zombies is just one example, but it is one that you see the word zombie more in this book than I think any other major canonical piece of political theory. So there's some food for thought. But what you can see here is that Fanon doesn't just take a Marxist approach. It's not just about the revolution of the proletariat, because as Fanon identifies, there is sort of this other more primary identity that is associated with but distinct from the class division, and that is the colonial division, right? That the colonizer and the colonized includes elements like the colonial bourgeois, right? The co-opted elites of colonized society that are in league with and are sort of the representatives and the carriers of and the enforcers and the spreaders of colonial ideology and values and institutions. They make it all click and work. And so there are these, and then there's beyond that, there's a fundamental extraction of resources from the colony to the colonizer, and some of these benefits, along with the ideology, the racist ideology that supports them, um, go to the colonizer proletariat, right? So these divisions are different, and he says that especially for the colonized society and colonized people, but perhaps for the whole world, this is the primary division that we have to deal with. Towards the end of the reading that we had on violence, he starts to talk about how in our era, the distinction between capitalist and socialist, as defined by the Cold War, is really somewhat secondary, because the whole system is coming to a standstill. It's being gummed up, threatening to collapse because of its sort of um, uh, commitment to maintaining the colonial system while that system is inevitably breaking apart. And so he sort of says, and I say it down here, that this, hey, he loves socialism compared to capitalism, and some of the values and realities associated um, with communal socialist rule versus exploitative capitalist rule. But he basically says that those questions are going to have to be dealt with after colonial reparations, after things are squared up in terms of the harms and the deficiencies that were created by the colonial system. And then maybe we can get to universal values. But even with that, he ends up by saying, we should probably just put all this Western stuff, Western history, Western values, Western institutions, Western constitutions, all of that behind us, and make our own way in the world. The Americans messed up because when they got their independence, they just became Europe 2.0, and they reproduced all of the biases and all of the inhumanity and all of the capitalist greed on an even higher scale and even greater scale than Europe. All right, so this idea that we're talking about Marxist class consciousness, Marxist analysis, which sees sort of the norms and values and institutions of the world as a reflection and a support system superstructure in service of the dominant class. But that class is the colonial class, right? There's a predominance of the colonial relationship over the mere class relationship, and that's this race and class thing. Race and class. That's in modern political thought, and particularly in American political thought. This isn't American, but in American political thought, the race and class intersection is perhaps our most difficult and interesting one. And so Fanon is really, he's right on it, and he's giving essential commentary that ups the importance of race in this account. He also gives us the most full-throated, in-your-face, I'm going to own it defense of violence, be that whatever means of violence, be it revolution, through armed struggle, through insurrection, through terrorism and assassination, whatever kind of violence, it's good if it's in service of liberating colonized people and expelling or destroying a colonizing people. All right, so this is an important contrast, I think, to both Gandhi and King. So why is violence so great for Fanon? Well, I think that he makes a lot of strong points here. Now, they might be points that only apply to a situation of actual colonization, which might include India, that Gandhi's writing about, but certainly includes Algeria and various African territories that were colonized and carved up by European powers. But maybe it also applies to more colonial adjacent situations like racial caste systems like we have in America. I think that there's a strong argument to be made that there's a material and situational distinction between what, say, King is dealing with in America and what Fanon is looking like at in places like Algeria. But for colonies and for the colonized, there is a argument in favor of the practical force of violence as a way to secure independence. And he's sort of piggybacking and maybe more persuasively putting forward the idea that Marx develops here, that hey, the proletariat, it's like almost everyone. They may not have the tanks, and they may not have the cash, but when 90 or 95% of the public wakes up, gets class conscious, and realizes that they all share fundamental interests, and those interests are fundamentally at odds with that 5 or 10% or 1% or whatever it is of the ruling bourgeois class that owns stuff because they say so, and because they have papers that say so, and laws and norms like meritocracy and property ownership that say so, and courts that say you should say so, institutions like that. In the end, what they have is the police and the military. And even the police and the military is mostly made up of working class people, right? Like, the monopoly millionaire guy isn't in the military or the police. He tells them what to do. As soon as those people realize, hey, you're not like my people. These people in the streets are my people. It's all over, right? Marx says that once you get to class consciousness and break through all of the lies and the distortions of the superstructure that divide, like racism and religious bigotry and meritocracy and all of the liberalism, all of these ideas that tell you, no, the way things are set up is just and right, and it's the way it should be, and you deserve your place. Once you break through all of that for the masses, it's all over. And Fanon says, well, it's the same thing in the colony, right? Like, whether it's a heavy colonial presence and it's like 30-1 colonized, or whether it's like a typical 100-1, 500-1, 1,000-1. When you get 500 people who say, no, we're done with this, right? We see our fundamental interest as getting rid of you, flipping the situation, flipping the script, putting you on the bottom, or eliminating you, or expelling you, and putting us on top. What can you do to stop that? How can in the long run planes and bombs and machine guns stop that? And what's more, Fanon talks about the situation of the modern state, where colonial exploitation, and particularly the exploitation of the colonizing bourgeois, so the property owners, the property owning elite in colonizing countries like France. Um, they don't want to move to Algeria. They want, and they don't even want to just take like their gold or something like this is the 17th century. What they want is to extract the labor and sell their products to the colonized world. They see it as a labor and market resource that they can extract through a fundamentally sort of asymmetrical, unequal relationship, and they can just keep drawing off cash from it. They can capitalize on that labor to create capital. Well, they don't want to kill everyone, and they don't want to, these business owners, and they don't want to have constant war, and they don't want to have to pay for a military occupation like we had for 20 years in Afghanistan. None of this is good business. And so Fanon also says, and we got a Cold War. There are two sides. No side can afford to go too all in on a military occupation of a people who is gonna, in that case, side with their adversary, like we saw with Vietnam embracing communism basically as a nationalist struggle, right? Like, go watch Ken Burns' documentary on Vietnam. The Vietnamese were not ideologically communist before the conflict. I mean, there may have been some sympathies, but it was like you actually had Ho Chi Minh saying like, "Hey, you know who we're like? We're like the American Revolution." Thomas Jefferson. He's quoting Thomas Jefferson to support throwing off the French. And then we're like, no, we side, America sides with the French, and they're like, okay, we're with the communists, right? There's this idea that given the constraints of the Cold War, given the constraints of modern finance, there's only so much military might that can be brought against the colonies. And so the masses in those colonies are going to have a practical advantage. It's almost inevitable that they're going to be able to secure their freedom if they can start working together. And so this gets to the second idea, the idea that violence, even before the ultimate, revolution that topples the colonizer, even before that, violence is unifying, right? This is flipping the script on what King is saying. King wants integration between the oppressor and the oppressed, and so he's looking. He's like, oh, we can't have violence because violence will polarize the oppressor and the oppressed. It'll solidify those identities and define those identities in opposition, in fundamental opposition. So we can't have any violence. And Fanon says, exactly, that's what we need, right? We go and we kill a colonial, estate owner, we break into some mansion with some colonist farmer in it, and we, kill their family and steal all their stuff. And you know what happens, right? One, hey, we feel pretty good and powerful. But then the colonizers, they kill 100 people. They imprison 1,000 people. They break into our homes. They persecute us. They interrogate us. And you know what? Us versus them becomes pretty solidified. And as he says throughout the book, the goal of decolonization is flipping us for them. Us is on the bottom. Them is on top. Once we get our shit together, we'll flip it, and us will be on the top, and they'll be dead or gone or on the bottom, and that's the goal. And so the more you can solidify us and them as conflictual identities, the more he thinks you can push it towards the inevitable result. Just like how Marx said, once you get us versus them as the dominant ideologies, the dominant identities, is really what I was trying to say there, of the capitalists and the masses, the bourgeois and the proletariat. Though that's a fundamentally asymmetric power situation where the people who are currently on the bottom are going to just throw off their shackles and be on top. They just have too much power in that situation to be constrained. Right? The constraint in that case takes ideology and institutions and divisions, and right, like that's the superstructure does all that work to mask and hide and facilitate the survival of this fundamental reversal of the natural power structure. The many, many being ruled by the few. Why? Why would they put up with it? They think they have to, or they need to, or they benefit, right? And all those things, once they peel away and people see clear-eyed. Oh my God, the situation, we're being exploited. Our interest is fundamentally against them. Let's get rid of them. Right? So there's a unifying kind of cycle of violence that Fanon thinks once you get the cycle of violence going, there's no way in this modern world that the colonizer is going to be able to hang on. And again, this becomes an ideology, I think, that empowers and emboldens insurgent revolutions throughout the colonized world in mid-century. They say, "Hey, this Fanon guy is right. If we just, all we got to do is be violent, and then they'll be violent, and it'll be us versus them, and eventually, us is going to win. This is our land. They don't want to eliminate us. They don't want to come move all their people here. We're here. We ain't going anywhere." Right? Let's get it on. Let's fight. Right? Like that's the idea here. Um, this third part, I think, is underappreciated in Fanon's thought. Right? If building on his analysis and Black Skin, White Mask, he thinks that violence is cathartic. It is healing. We have individuals who have grown up under colonial ideology that tells them that they are less than fully human, that tells them that their experiences of being real, thinking, feeling human beings are somehow wrong, that they should be ashamed of who they are because of their ancestry, because of the color of their skin, that this is deeply harmful and it is deeply dehumanizing. And it breaks up community. It turns colonized person, colonized group against colonized person, colonized group, fractures and divides, and leads to colonized people blowing off steam and violent acts against each other. Right? That like all of the dysfunction, both individually and socially in the colonies, is the colonizer's fault. And so what do you do about that? You recognize your own equality and dignity and say, you can't treat us like that. And you strike back. And in the violent act of asserting yourself against your oppressor, you seize a new identity, one that has more dignity, one that recognizes you're just as if not better, you're just as good, if not better than the colonizer, and that you as a people are a people. Right? That your status is not defined by submission under the colonizer. Your new status, is built by the act of unifying and throwing them off. So this idea that it's psychologically good and healing, right? MLK and Gandhi both told us that engaging in that kind of violent, vicious, angry, rage-filled behavior is dehumanizing. It drags you down to the colonizer's level. It makes you degraded. How dare your oppression make me stoop so low? Fanon's like, nah, it restores your dignity. It gives you back your full and equal humanity. It gives you your agency. And it makes you proud to say, I'm a blank, whatever your nation is that's been colonized, right? And maybe that doesn't convince you, but I think it's an important adjunct to the practical. Oh, we're just going to win, right? Because again, Martin Luther King and Gandhi say, what kind of win is that? That's not a real win, right? You'll lose by winning. You'll lose yourself, gaining power, gaining land, gaining money. Fanon says, no, you'll finally be free and you'll finally be something closer to whole. And so it shapes individuals and a nation for self-rule. It destroys their association with the colonial identity, with the values, right? You're killing these people. You're fighting to the death against them. And the things that are associated with them, their values, their customs, their norms, their culture, it all loses its hold on you. It all comes to be seen as bad, evil, enemy. And you create your own new identity as a people asserting itself positively through an act of creation, an act of independence. Where does that sound familiar? Well, Fanon says, well, how about the American Revolution? How about those people who thought of themselves as British citizens, who were being treated unfairly as British citizens, as recently as a few years, prior to the Declaration of Independence and the start of hostilities. And you know what was forged by killing British soldiers and being killed by British soldiers? A identity that was American, that was unified, that was not a bunch of colonies with different allegiances and different identities, and a primary allegiance and identity that was British. It was America and Americans, right? Like there's a case to be made. He kind of just throws it out there as an example. Um, but to me, it resonated. This idea that like, could America have become America? Could American culture have solidified into something cohesive without violence against the British colonizer? I don't know, right? And did violence in the Civil War, the act of violently struggling, killing, dying, white and black, in order to reform this union without the institution of slavery, did that make possible a jump away from, if not all the way, partially away from a fundamentally race-based, racist, caste-based understanding of the Constitution, the kind of thing that the Dred Scott decision talks about, how this was, fundamentally a white nation built on white supremacy and the fundamental division between the races. Black people can never be citizens, right? We had that just like 10 years before the Civil War. And, less, right? Maybe that gets transformed by the act of struggling, fighting. You get people, think of Gangs of New York, if you've seen Gangs of New York. You get people who don't really want to go fight this war, who don't really believe in racial equality, but you send them down to the South to struggle and kill and die and watch their fellows struggle and kill and die, and struggle and kill and die with black soldiers as well. And maybe that's transformational to the psyche, and both individually and collectively. I think that there's an interesting argument to be made here, and maybe it pushes back against, hey King, you're peaceful, nonviolent struggle in the South. Maybe it didn't do as much to transform not simply the participants, but the oppressor as you wanted to, than you thought. I don't know, right? I mean, I think you can make arguments both ways, but I think it's an interesting case for the power of violence to reshape and heal out of a situation of trauma. Right, socialist through and through. I think that's about all we want to talk about. The one thing I will say, and I don't think I mentioned this yet, is that Fanon is like, all right, listen, the colonized world is really really messed up after the colonists leave. They take all of their institutions and their administrative skill and capacity, their bureaucracy, their financial and economic tools. Capital flees right before the revolution, right? The business owners suck all of their resources out. Supply chains are cut off. And then after the revolution, the colonizers, instead of trying to make things right, they typically use their economic power to cut off and isolate, much as he says over and over again, the U.S. did to Cuba, which they weren't, anyway. That wasn't an exact parallel, but he uses the Cuba example quite often. Right, that this kind of marginalization, isolation, and prevention of development, that this is a problem, right? This prevents progress in the colonies, and what we need is a transfer, a reparation, a transfer from the developed colonizing world to the undeveloped or less developed colonized or formerly colonized world. But for all his discussion of how the power of the numerical, colonized is going to throw off the colonizer, he doesn't give a very good explanation at any point that I've seen in this book for how formerly colonized countries are going to get out from under the yoke of the IMF, the WTO, to force France and Britain and the rest of Europe and America to make massive transfers of wealth for reparations to restore and allow colonized nations to move off independently on their own and seek, new, more humane ways of living once they've been restored the capacity that was stolen from them by the colonized world. I don't know. The one place where it really actually kind of hit home for me was with climate change. Right? We've had these centuries of extraction by the developed and colonizing world from the undeveloped and colonized world. And we have pumped this world full of carbon dioxide. And now, as the developing world develops and they're burning coal and oil and gas, and they say, you want us not to drive this car over the edge of the cliff, you better give us them reparations, perhaps in the form of massive investments in infrastructure and clean energy technology. You better give it all to us right now, or this planet is cooked. I think that there's sort of an interesting premonition. There are elements in Fanon that, to me, foreshadow that kind of situation. Maybe he knew all along that there would end up being some kind of dependence of the developed Western world on the what he calls the third world. It didn't seem to me like it was clearly articulated in the book itself, but boy, it does have a feeling of truth now. So perhaps, right? Perhaps he is right that before we tackle any of our other problems in this world, it's the legacy of colonization that needs to be addressed. So that is an idea that comes out of Fanon. Wow, what a long video! It got even longer the second time I recorded this last clip. Sorry about that. Sorry about the lighting. Yeah. Cheers, folks. Cheers, y'all.